The harquebusier was the most common form of cavalry found throughout Western Europe during the early and mid-17th century. Early harquebusiers were characterized by the use of a form of carbine, called a harquebus. In England, harquebusier was the technical name for this type of cavalry, though in everyday usage they were usually simply called cavalry or horse. In Germany they were often termed ringerpferd, or sometimes reiter. In Sweden they were called lätta ryttare. Development. According to John Crusoe in his Cavalry Manual of 1632, the harquebusier was first invented in France. Quote, "This type of cavalryman was characterized by the use of a form of carbine. The earliest type of carbine used was called a harquebus. In the late 16th century and into the first decades of the following century, the harquebusier was envisioned, like the similar and earlier petronel, as a support for more heavily armored cavalry, demi-lances or pistol-armed cuirassiers and reiters. Later, towards the mid-17th century, the harquebusier became the standard type of cavalry found throughout Western Europe. The switch of the harquebusier from a mounted support role, reliant on firearms, to one of shock-capable close combat cavalry can be attributed to Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden in the 1620s and 1630s. Initially, this was from necessity. Sweden was a relatively poor nation and could not afford to equip many expensive cuirassiers. Therefore, more lightly equipped cavalry had to be employed in a shock role. The success of Swedish cavalry in battle during the 30 Years' War led to other nations adopting the methods. Gustavus Adolphus also reduced the number of ranks in a cavalry formation from the previously usual 6 to 10 for pistol-based tactics, to 3 to suit his sword-based shock tactics. The later harquebusier was used in a shock role by cavalry leaders of the English Civil War, such as Prince Rupert of the Rhine and Oliver Cromwell. They employed harquebusiers very aggressively, charging with sword in hand, thus relegating the firearms to a secondary function. Indeed, by the 1620s, cavalry not equipped with a carbine could be termed harquebusiers, just from the level and style of their armor protection. By the time of the English Civil War, all cavalry not equipped as cuirassiers are carrying a lance. The Scots fielded light lances as late as the 1650s, were called harquebusiers. In the course of the war, the cuirassier ceased to be fielded in Britain, and when the cuirassier discarded his limb armor, he instantly became indistinguishable from the harquebusier. Equipment. The typical harquebusier would have worn an iron cuirass, with a breast and backplate, and an open-faced helmet such as a lobster-tailed pot. The fashion-conscious could replace the helmet with a broad-brimmed felt hat, often worn over concealed iron skull-cap. In England, in 1629, a harquebusier's armor cost £1.06, that of a cuirassier £4.10. A more wealthy harquebusier may have worn a buff coat under his armor and a metal gauntlet to protect his bridle hand and forearm. Also worn were tall, cuff-topped riding boots. These reached the thigh and were often also of buff leather. The harquebusier would usually have been armed with a dog-lock carbine, hung from a swivel attached to a baldric pistols, either wheel-lock or flintlock in saddle holsters, and a stout, straight-bladed sword. The dog of the doglock was a type of safety catch, very useful to prevent the unintentional firing of the carbine when on horseback. Records also indicate that some harquebusiers were also armed with a horseman's poleaxe pick. These were hafted weapons with axe or hammer heads and armor-piercing spikes. Organization. Harquebusiers were organized into troops, and a variable number of troops made up a regiment. The organization of the cavalry of the new model army in England was typical. Each troop was ideally composed of 100 cavalrymen, commanded by a captain, with 6 troops making a regiment under a colonel. Regiments were usually named after the colonel, and both the colonel and his second-in-command, the major or sergeant major, personally led their own troop. When the regimental colonel was also a general or had other duties, a stand-in termed a lieutenant colonel was appointed. Numbers of cavalrymen per troop were often lower than the ideal when on campaign, and some regiments had more troops than was normal. Prominent commanders also often had a lifeguard. Prince Rupert had a 10-troop regiment plus a lifeguard of 150 men, whilst Oliver Cromwell's regiment had 14 troops. Tactics. National variation in the battlefield employment of harquebusiers existed. The French tended to retain greater use of firearms. Often the harquebusiers would give a volley of carbine and a pistol fire before closing with the sword. The Swedes and Royalist English charged home directly with the sword, not using firearms until the melee. The parliamentarian cavalry retained the use of firearms in the charge until later in the Civil War, but by the time of the new model army had largely adopted the direct charge with the sword. The Royalists, under Prince Rupert's direction, began the Civil War using the Swedish 3 ranks deep formation, but the parliamentarians retained a 6 deep formation until late 1643 or early 1644. A cavalry unit drawn up in a shallow formation would outflank a similar-sized unit arrayed in a deep formation, a considerable tactical advantage. The Swedes and Royalist cavaliers usually charged at speed. The English parliamentarian Ironsides charged at a slower pace, troopers keeping together neatly in order to retain the formation. In England, many harquebusiers did not employ a carbine, as is described in Militaire Discipline of 1661. Many troops and regiments only with sword and pistol armed, their encounterings being not after the ancient manner of firing at a distance and wheeling off, which hath been found to be of dangerous consequence, but to fire at near distance, the swords hanging at the wrists by a string, and with the sword points charging through adverse troops. Demise. The term harquebusier fell out of use gradually as armor use declined and the fully armored cuirassier disappeared. Harquebusiers became part of the undifferentiated horse, or in French, cavalerie, of the early and mid-18th century. In the British Army, many cavalry regiments having their origins as units of harquebusiers eventually transformed into dragoons. In the last 2 decades of the 17th century, use of armor and a buff coat declined and helmets were more definitively replaced by felt hats, and uniform coats were widely adopted. As an example, all items of armor previously employed by the Regiment of Oxford Blues were ordered to be put in store in 1688 before the regiment went on active service. The equipment of the harquebusier disappeared at different rates. The doglock carbine was replaced by the true flintlock in the late 17th century. Cuirasses fell in and out of fashion during the 18th century before the Napoleonic Renaissance of the later type of cuirassier in the first decade of the 19th century. The lobster-tailed pot helmet fell out of favor in most countries by 1700, though the Austrian army retained this type of helmet for its cuirassiers into the 1780s, especially when campaigning against the Turks.